Hello and welcome to the Age of Meaning podcast. Have you ever wondered why the world is the way it is today? Have you ever felt like things are a little bit off at the moment? Like the world is not quite the way it should be, or the way that it used to be, maybe a couple of years ago? Have you ever felt like you're a little bit confused about life and what's going on with the world at the moment? Maybe you're a little bit depressed or anxious, and you don't quite understand why things are the way they are. You see, in the West today, we're going through something that's been called the meaning crisis. Now, you may or may not know this, but the Western mind has been going through a long process for thousands of years, determining its worldview and how it relates to the universe. At the moment, we've reached a kind of crucible about what we believe and who we are as people. You see, in the last few hundred years, we've moved away from Christianity and into a post-religious world where we no longer believe in God. We no longer have a shared overarching meaning structure. And what we're left with is a vague kind of scientific materialist worldview that doesn't really answer the deep questions of life or provide us any deeper meaning. It just kind of gives us some explanation, some logical explanations about the physical universe, but it says nothing about humanity and consciousness and the soul of mankind. And so we're left in this kind of void universe where we're floating in empty space and we're all going to die one day. And there's not really much else to do with anything. There's nowhere to ground our morals in. There's nowhere to ground truth in. And we're also living in this cultural relativism age where everything is relative. There's not even such a thing as truth or meaning anymore, according to a lot of people. And so this really has ginormous consequences for society. So we're going to be talking about this in this podcast. We're going to be talking about the meaning crisis. We're going to be talking about the current worldview and operating system or software that the West is running in its mind right now, and why it's actually no longer correct, because the current insights and the cutting edge of science at the moment, of science and academia, are debunking and have already debunked this classical realism, simplistic, mechanistic, reductionistic, physicalist view of the universe. And we also know that from our history, we have, in the West and in the East, we have these vast and beautiful traditions of wisdom and philosophy and spirituality, which actually answer these questions of the meaning crisis, and they can help us solve the meaning crisis. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about why the physical universe, the physical materialism view of the universe is no longer true, why it's so unsatisfying, and how that plays into some of the kind of problems of society that we see today. A lot of the chaos in society that we see, the moral debauchery, the moral decay, the general confusion and chaos that's going on at the moment. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So this is our first podcast. So bear with us if we're kind of just getting started, getting the hang of it a little bit. But a little bit of introduction about who we are as well. My name is Andrew Sampson, and our co-host is Florian Nuvendijk. And we met during our first year at our master's degrees at the University of Amsterdam, where we studied Western esotericism, the history of Western spirituality or spiritual thought or philosophy in the West, beginning with Plato in ancient Egypt, leading all the way up until the current day. And so we met during our master's program there. Florian continued on to do a research master's in Western esotericism, and I did another one-year master's in philosophy. And for the last 3 years, we've been having a lot of conversations about everything, about philosophy, spirituality, metaphysics, epistemology, psychology, politics, all kinds of things. And so we thought that we would just continue these conversations in a public space. So I hope you enjoy, and welcome to the podcast.
I think that's a good starting point to talk about what is the cultural moment, right, that we're living in. And I think the cultural moment that we're living in is also defined by the meaning crisis to a large extent. And I think in order to understand what we mean with that, or how we see the cultural moment as it's unfolding today, I have to give a bit of a historical overview of how we got here, right? But I think before we maybe get into that, sort of on an abstract level, I think what we're talking about is, we live in a world of meaning, basically. All of our experiences in life are defined by a certain set of qualities and meanings that we ascribe to those experiences, and that's very much determined by our cultural conditioning. or the broader cultural environment that we grow up in. Um, the discourse that we're surrounded by, for instance, but also more generally the world of ideas. I think it's the world of ideas that defines the way that we experience life, that defines the quality of our experience. And so you could say that really the world we live in is a world of meaning. Um, and I think that world of meaning, if you think about it like it's a room, for instance, or it's a house, then that world of meaning is furnished by certain ideas, and the ideas are like the furniture of the house. And I think there have been these time periods, like throughout history, these epochs that have been determined or by a certain type of furniture with a certain look, and people were living in a similar environment, right? People shared that furniture to a large extent, so they were living in the same house, and they were using the same furniture, and the furniture, looked similar. And I think we live now in a postmodern world where that's no longer the case. So the universality or the 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 collectivity of the furniture that we're surrounded by, the furniture of ideas, has been shattered, basically. And now everybody seems to live in a different room, surrounded by a different type of furniture. Or some people live in an empty room, perhaps with no furniture at all, or the furniture is it's chaotic, right? Or it's dissonant, and it's not coherent, it's not integrated, and it's not really satisfying. It's sort of like it's ugly, or it doesn't even look like it's meant to be used. The furniture that we're surrounded by nowadays. If we can extend the allegory. Um, so that's sort of that's my take on the cultural moment that we're living in from an abstract level using this analogy. What do you think about
So
that?
yeah, so the furniture metaphor is like well, what you're talking about there is what the furniture is our kind of ideas about the world, our beliefs about the world, right? Our values
Mm-hmm.
about the world, our sense of morality and what's right and wrong, and what we should do with our lives, what's the point of life, or what we ought to do with ourselves. And it's kind of fundamental metaphysical questions. So I think it's one of the interesting things is that people don't realize that they have a worldview that's like installed in their mind,
Mm-hmm.
because it's just kind of assumed that your perception of the world and the worldview that you were taught as a culture, that's just like the natural view.
Yeah.
But people don't really realize like they have a worldview, they have an operating system, almost have a software that's
Mm-hmm.
running in their mind. And the operating system that we currently have, it affects everything. It affects so many things. Like it's difficult to like elucidate how one's worldview, whether it's materialism or something else, like affects every aspect of life and how you see the world, how you see everything. So the current worldview that we have is kind of a new phenomenon in human history. It's a new
Mm-hmm.
worldview that only emerged around 400 years ago and then really became solidified about 200 years ago. According to Bernardo Kastrup's book that I was reading the other day, he really traces it to those two points in time, in the 1600s and
Mm-hmm.
then 1800s with the Enlightenment. And so now the furniture in our house is all Enlightenment furniture, or Enlightenment, or um, materialistic furniture. That's kind of like the default substrate of our culture, I would say. So a lot of people might have more spiritual leaning views, or they might be Christian or religious, or have sort of intuitions that are more spiritual, but they still kind of everyone subscribes to like a base level materialism. I would say a
Mm-hmm.
base level kind of
Mm-hmm.
scientism and materialism, logical rationalism, which is like the set by bedrock of our society.
Yeah.
And so,
That's like the default package you get, right? Like the default package
right,
that you're always going to be surrounded by consists of that materialistic worldview. And then if you feel like that's not enough, or if you have certain spiritual intuitions or something like that, or you're looking for something more, you're looking for different sources of meaning, then you have to basically go out there and forage your own pieces of furniture to bring back into your world, right?
Right.
But
Yeah.
the ones that are there, like the floor and the curtains are there by default. You kind of move into that, and that's gonna be, part of that cultural conditioning, and
Hmm.
at this moment that's a materialistic worldview, right?
Right. And you have to go find other furniture, furnish yourself other furniture to get more meaning. And
Yeah.
so I think that's kind of the next kind of there's two kind of things that come to mind is defining the materialist worldview and
Hmm.
scientism, and defining why there's why, like arguing why there's not enough meaning to be drawn from that. What's the problem
Hmm.
with that? What's the lack of meaning in that?
Yeah.
So
And then I think after that, you can start to then explore. So if the materialistic worldview is problematic or insufficient in being as a source of meaning, then the question becomes: so then where should we look, right? To what should we
uh-huh,
turn in order to find the meaning that we don't find in the materialistic worldview? And then you can start an
right.
exploration of different ontologies or different worldviews, different ways of making sense of reality. Different ways of answering the question of, like, what type of universe do we live in? What type of universe do we actually live in?
Right.
And that's a huge project. And I think as a culture, this is a question that we are now facing, and that we have to come up with an answer to that. And in a way, we have to come up with a collective answer, because that's the way that a culture can operate most effectively. If or that's the way that seems to go, right? A new answer to that question emerges, and kind of outcompetes the old answer, like is more satisfying, or it gives a better, broader answer, and then that spreads, and then a new paradigm establishes itself. And I think we're at the cusp of that in our culture. So we're now answering that question again, like, what type of universe are we really living in? Because
Uh-huh.
the answer that we got before, of, like, well, it's basically a dead material universe out of which life emerged by chance as a mere fluke, and there's nothing sacred about it, and there is no dimension beyond that. That answer has become played out, and it's had its day, but now it seems to no longer satisfy the deeper existential questions.
Hmm. And I think people kind of thought maybe that it will satisfy the deeper existential questions, but now, like you say,
Hmm.
it's played out. It's been a while now, I would say, of a couple generations being born and raised with this paradigm. And yeah, and also some of the breakthroughs within science have also made it that the simplistic mechanistic worldview, which was kind of like the kernel of the materialist
Hmm.
paradigm, kind of billiard balls, atoms and molecules, like mechanistic world, is not really true anyway, according to quantum physics and whatnot. So
Right, right,
yeah, um, yeah, and I think at the moment now, like, yeah, the world is just kind of a little bit frayed. So there is this kind of question like this. It's being asked of us, what kind of universe do we live in? Because, and generally, what kind of world do we live in? What kind of world should we live in?
hmm
Because now I think the world itself is so frayed, and it's in such a different place with the internet and online culture, and just the sheer levels of novelty and newness that's going on right now,
hmm
and the change that's going on, and the fragmentation of society, like political, like the extremism, like polarization, and this kind of like absurdism that's going on in the world, this kind of political absurdism and general absurdism with content that you see on your phone. It's like it's so debased, it's so like out of control, it's so
right,
random,
yeah,
and kind
yeah,
of um it's like there's so much moral decay everywhere, I would say.
right, right, right,
And that's another point that I think ties into the lack of um the with a strictly material dead universe, as you said, like, then moral decay is more likely to happen because there's nothing to ground morality in.
right. There's nothing to
And
be attuned with, right?
yeah, and there's nothing to ground like the good, the true, and the beautiful in, because there is no such thing as the good, the true, and the beautiful in the
No,
materialist
it's all
paradigm.
subjective, right? Yeah, exactly.
Those are just subjective thoughts and whatnot.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's not the only paradigm.
Which is
So
interesting, right? Because there are epistemologies, that there are ways of coming to knowledge about that metaphysical domain that can bring you closer to truth. That has always been a guiding principle, right? But since the postmodern turn, that very principle, which has been foundational, has been thrown out, and in its place is the idea that, well, it's all just relative, and it's always going to just be an artifact of our mind, and it originates with us. Whatever meaning we think we find, it always originates with us, and so there's always an arbitrary element to it, and it's always relative to other ways of making sense. And that's, I think, what in a way causes the crisis that we find ourselves in. And at the
yeah,
same
for sure, the
time,
relativity, the
yeah.
relativism. Yeah, no, continue.
Well, at the same time, I think that relativity also holds the key to an answer to the crisis. An answer to the problem or a solution. Because I think if everything is relative, then basically you're free to to engage with a different way of viewing reality, a different way of understanding reality, because basically you can just choose from this palette of ways of making sense, different systems of meaning. There's a whole palette available to you. It's all relative. It's all in a way subjective and arbitrary. So you can just choose whatever fits you, and that seems to be a little bit like the marketplace of ideas that we live in nowadays. Because in a way we are forced to live by a set of meaning, a set of values, a system of meaning anyway. So you have to adopt something. You're always operating on some kind of mythology, you might say, a way of understanding reality, a story that you're ascribing to reality. And since that is the case, then I think that also means that if you choose to engage with a mythology that actually does postulate the existence of something outside of yourself, that is actually true, then you can re-engage with that type of epistemology. And so then you can go beyond this postmodern predicament where, everything is relative, so you can't really know anything anyway, to the point where, like, no, you have to operate on some kind of system of meaning making. And so then when you engage with a system, then it might as well be a system that gives you profound meaning by postulating the existence of something, real outside of, just your subjective projections. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely makes sense. I would say that's a great articulation of kind of the problem of relativism that we're in, because there's kind of that point in the abstract philosophical, like in society, or where we are philosophically, I guess, with postmodernism, is that now everything's relative, so you can just choose what you want to believe. So then everyone's believing their own stuff, and no one feels like they've got the one true thing, because it always feels like it's subjective, and anything can always be undermined as subjectivity. And I think what led to that, kind of before relativism emerged, was the scientific turn as well, which also then posited that there's only such, like, objectivity is the only thing that's true and valuable.
Right.
So it's objectivism. Right. It's a bias towards objectivity. And so then that cast aside anything that's subjective. So all subjectivity was then obviously deemed as irrational and groundless, and anything can be called that's just subjective, and that takes away the argument. But that's just a bias, really, which you find, in studying the philosophy of science, is that that's just a bias that really has no basis, because all objectivity in science is still somehow entangled with subjectivity. So it can never be escaped. Subjectivity can never be escaped from. Um, and so then you have the relativism stage. But I mean, what you said um, about how we can choose to believe something and choose that we can kind of know something. Um, yeah, I mean, I feel like that is the point that's one way of going about it, where people can decide, okay, even though it's subjective and I don't really have access to truth, like to some sort of absolute truth or fundamental thing, I'm just going to decide like this is my meaning because you're running a meaning thing anyway, a
Mm-hmm.
meaning program, and so I'm just going to choose this worldview. I think
Yeah.
that's a fair thing. That's a good like that's totally fair. But then also, I would say like you could even we could take that further. I mean, as humans, I feel like there's got to be some way to actually find some sort of truth. You know, if the good, the true, and the beautiful exists, then it's got to be some way that we can go further than, well, I'll just believe it because it might as well, because, you know, because then you're still kind of stuck in the relativism problem because then everyone can
Mm-hmm.
believe things. So I think it's kind of moving into stage. It is a true, there is a truth to that, but I think moving into like the integral stage or the stage yellow in spiral dynamics,
Yeah.
um, that that there's kind of a way around this problem where there are certain almost there it's almost like there are certain universals um, that can be experienced and kind of
Hmm.
through direct experience with through just subjectivity that there is a kind of ground that can be found that then like a deep sense of meaning can be built on, and that's kind of
Right.
what we find in the deep spiritual mystical traditions and certain
Mm-hmm.
philosophies around the world that share this common thing. You kind of
Mm-hmm.
do, in my mind, it's for me personally, it seems like there is a kind of ground to be found that then can be built out, which is unique and individual to everyone, but it still kind of shares this grounding.
Right.
So maybe we're also getting a little bit lost in these weeds, which is but it's still very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, did you want
Yeah.
to
Well,
comment on
it's
that
still
or
relevant, I think, because it's
yeah?
what we're talking about. It really addresses the cultural moment that we're living in, right?
Hmm.
And it's kind of like the cultural moment is tied up with the philosophical moment,
For sure,
uh,
100%. Yeah.
and like culture follows this whole developmental pattern, and philosophy also follows a developmental pattern, and there's like this dialogue going on, and then you sometimes you reach an impasse, and what John Vervaeke calls domicide, right? It's like it's the murder of your home, which ties into this
Mm.
idea that like you live in an environment which is furnished by meaning, by ideas. And when those
Hmm.
ideas get sort of canceled out or they get refuted, and then you live in, well, then you're robbed of your home, right? Your home is dead or murdered.
For sure, that's a great. Yeah.
And yeah, and so that is the moment we're living in. And I think it's interesting what you're postulating is sort of that, there are solid, philosophically solid arguments to be made for, different worldviews.
Hmm.
And what's more, that those worldviews might also actually then afford different types of experience, and then that can be sort of a reinforcing feedback loop, where if you have a certain worldview, then that worldview actually affords you to have a certain type of experience you might not otherwise have. Or if you would have that experience, you might write off that experience as, merely subjective. But if you have a worldview that allows for that experience to maybe tell you something about the nature of reality, for instance, what you might call a religious experience or a mystical experience, and you're open to that experience actually giving you, insight and knowledge into the nature of reality, bringing you to a new form of knowledge you might not have otherwise attained, um, then that experience can reinforce or enrich that worldview. And sometimes you have to then, you have to go past skepticism, right? Because if you stay stuck in a skeptical mindset, then what that might mean is that there are certain experiences that you will never have simply because you're not open to them. and
Mm-hmm.
then that means that you will never encounter any evidence to the contrary of your bias, and then you're not going to get out of that conundrum. So you have to
Right.
loosen up a little bit, and at least in a playful way, be willing to entertain different worldviews or different ontologies. And there's no reason why you shouldn't do that, because if you accept the notion that everything is relative, then you might as well explore alternatives. And then if everything is relative, that means that also the view that everything is relative is one of the relative options available to
Right.
you,
Yeah.
right? And the view that actually no, there are absolutes out there, that's also one of the relative options to you. And so you might as well engage with that to see what it can afford you. And I
So
like your
that's yeah.
argument that that there are solid arguments to make for all the alternative worldviews. And I wonder what you think about the sort of the pragmatic argument that you could say that, well, the value of one worldview as opposed to another really is determined by the effect that it has on the quality of your life, and how that sort of features out more broadly. So you might say that if you juxtapose different worldviews against each other, and one is sort of a materialistic worldview that's atheistic, um, and morally relativistic, and you juxtapose that to a worldview that's sacred and that's informed by some kind of religious moral code, to see what the effect is that has on one's life, might actually give you a good impression on the value of these respective worldviews. And so then that would allow you to make an argument in favor of one over the other, where it's no longer about which one is true, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
any and all might be true if everything is relative. And so then this would be an alternative way to differentiate in the quality of the worldviews. What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I think for me the pragmatism argument doesn't hit as hard for me, because for me it's got to be true. Like that's like that's an important feature. That's a very important
Mm-hmm.
feature. And I think there's ways in which the normal scientific materialist paradigm is not true. I mean, there are ways where we're going to talk about that later. I think where
Mm-hmm.
materialism, it's not true anymore. It can be established, being established philosophically. It's the new establishment, new cutting edge establishment that's not fully established right now, but I would say will be maybe. But yeah. So pragmatism, it's true. I mean, people. I would say that people that are living a spiritual life definitely have more meaning in their life. Maybe generally. I mean, you also wouldn't want to say that someone who's not involved in kind of spiritual activities or philosophical things, or doesn't live in a Christian worldview or a idealist worldview or something, that they're less happy, because it depends on everyone. But as a society, I mean, you could definitely make that point. I think that we we've lost our kind of overarching meaning structure that was a
Mm-hmm.
unifying force. That was also a positive force. It wasn't just a random, arbitrary unifying force. It was a something that kind of gave a sense of meaning and beauty and purpose and container. Like it was a beautiful home. It was a home that was nicely decorated that we enjoyed for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm not talking about like Christianity basically,
Yeah.
or just the general kind of kind of old school religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, the kind of like pre-scientific enlightenment standard kind of religion in the West that was mainly Christianity.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so I mean with that, we're losing that, and now that we have this uh, post-religious world, there's definitely pragmatic consequences to that, because people are now this is that I think that's one of the major reasons why we're in the meaning crisis, because there's a crisis now, because there used to be an agreed upon shared meaning.
Yeah.
Now there's a crisis because we don't have something that gives us that like umbrella.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Also because it has an impact on all these different domains of life. It's not just about the ideas themselves, right? What you believe in. It's not about just the sort of the
No,
propositions of faith. but
Yeah.
it's the whole structure, you know, of your society, and it determines social interactions, and it determines economical activity, and it determines political activity. And I think for me, one of the most poignant facts by which you can see that we're in a crisis is that really is on the domain of rituals, because I think in our Western you know, or you know, highly developed, highly educated, you know, societies, um, which have become secularized, right, more and more, that what we have lost most of all is a ritual, you know, that brings us together, in community, and that
Yeah.
establishes a relationship, you know, with time and space, where that's sort of set apart as something sacred, as something with profound significance, profound meaning, and that set apart time then becomes a portal to relate to, you know, the sacred, you know,
Hmm.
to relate to
Yeah.
that which is transcendent, and we've completely lost that. And
Yeah.
we still have rituals, but now our rituals have become completely banal, right? And our
Mm.
rituals are like, you know, transactional economic activity. It's like shopping is the ritual that defines many people's lives, or
Yeah.
sports,
Or like
right? People
watching sport. Yeah, I
go
was
to
gonna say
sports
that.
events,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But
Watching the sport with your family, but
compared to the depth
it's
and
great. But
significance
yeah.
of religious rituals, you know, or more anciently, sort of, you know, the kind of tribal animistic rituals, which are sort of pre-religious maybe, but definitely have that deep, profound
Yeah.
spiritual
Yeah.
significance that is
Or
now
even
completely
compared
missing.
to, going to church on a Sunday, like in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
more
yeah,
recent past. I mean, that is a ritual that gave you punctuated people's lives,
yeah,
and it was like, you go to church and then that's set aside as a different thing. Then
yeah,
imagine how nice that would have been. Like if it was all wholesome and nice, just
yeah,
for us, like us, millennial Zoomer generation, is like adult phone, TikTok adult, and everything. It's
yeah,
like every week you went to church on Sunday, and it was like it's not about work or productivity or dopamine or something. We're here as a community. There's some sort of relationship with like the cosmos that we're engaged in, and there's a moral
right,
dimension. That's
yeah,
how it was. Like everyone, that was a big thing. I mean, the church was an institution in all society.
yeah,
So yeah, I mean, now it's kind of like life's just it's just kind of ended. There's no punctuation that changes kind of a cycle. I would say a cycle between almost work and productivity,
hmm,
um, and then pleasure, basically,
yeah,
or
that's right,
or relationships and friends, which is great. But
yeah,
there's nothing that's profound. There used to be something that was like profound as opposed to mundane,
yeah,
that was set aside, which was nice. I would imagine
yeah,
that would have been nice. Yeah.
absolutely. It's all been profaned, you know, like all of this cultural activity is now just profane
Mm,
and no longer sacred.
yeah.
And
It's so profane. It's profanity. It's all over the place.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's debased. It's morally debased. And that's, yeah. But there's so many things. I really like that. So many things to think about. I've been thinking about this lately, the last couple of weeks, about how
Hmm.
how morality ties into like ontology or an overarching
Hmm.
worldview.
Absolutely.
Because and I used to, when I first got into spirituality and philosophy, for me morality always seemed like a less interesting topic, because I was like, well, it's relative and it's about being like a good boy or something, or being a good person, and really it comes down to how you feel and in the
Hmm.
moment and whatever. But realizing more, like the deeper elements of morality that are attached into it, kind
Yeah,
of also like the aesthetic qualities and how you ought to live your life, what how to
yeah.
live the good life and stuff like that. Yeah, that if there's a nihilism and there's ultimately no meaning and we're just on a rock floating in empty space, then there's no point to trying to be a good person or living a good life, besides just for your own selfishness.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, now people do things like shamelessly in society, and it's kind of like morality is kind of thrown out the window a little bit. And you see that, I would say, like in society now with the politics, like with Trump and stuff, like it's just out the window. Like we've tolerated or created and tolerated a situation where, like, it seems like every day, like our standards for what is acceptable just gets thrown out the window. It gets moved more and more to the absurd, and that's not a good thing ultimately for society. Obviously,
Right.
you don't want to
And there's
start
no,
sounding
yeah,
like a you don't want to start sounding like a someone who's like, we need traditional values and stuff, because that's not
right.
the same. That's not the same instinct. But
No,
there's
that
just a
that's also,
lack
that
of
doesn't,
yeah. There's a lack of the broader moral aesthetic quality, and like, what should you do with your life? What do you what how should we live? And
yeah,
should you be striving towards something great or towards something higher than yourself, or aligning yourself with some
right.
higher principle? Because if you're just on a ball and empty space that's in a dead universe, then why
Yeah,
do any
yeah,
of
yeah,
that?
yeah, 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 yeah.
So yeah, maybe we can talk about that also later at another point. But I thought it might be a good idea to read these definitions of the meaning crisis by John Vervaeke,
Mm-hmm.
just to kind of continue with the earlier thread.
Yeah.
So first one he'd explain, just kind of, just to kind of hit the nail. I feel like he really hits the nail on the head of what we're talking about here. So this is from his book, and he says the meaning crisis has something to do with the decentering of human life from its cosmic significance, a decline in our sense of purpose, and a sensation of having lost the soul that gave earlier human societies their adaptiveness and vitality. Lost the soul that earlier societies had that gave them their vitality. And it seems that we are left with a feeling of having lost our place in the world, along with a sense of who we are and what we ought to do with ourselves. So I feel like a sense of our place in the world and who we are and what we ought to do with ourselves. That's like
Mm-hmm.
it's a good three things. Like, who are we?
Yeah,
What are we?
yeah, exactly,
What
exactly.
is our place in this universe? And what should we
Yeah.
do? What should we do in
It's
general?
interesting, for me, it also connects with the word cosmos, which, you used that earlier, because of course the original meaning of the word cosmos is order, right? And so the idea is that, like, we're part of a cosmos, which means that we're part of a higher order, right? And I think nowadays you might say that in a secular materialistic worldview, that the cosmos is really the order that there is the order that you can sort of establish with scientific research, right? In principle, it's through empirical study that you can establish the order, which means that the order that you come to describe is the order of just that dimension of just the material universe, or whatever you can establish with a scientific method, even when it goes beyond simply material in the domain of quantum physics, for instance. It leaves undescribed this, a higher order, because if that higher order is transcendent or metaphysical, meaning it's not manifest in physical form, that means that with the scientific method you can't study that. And because we have been so focused on using the scientific methods to establish what the nature is of the cosmos that we're living in, means that that whole higher dimension of order, is overlooked, is ignored. But and
Mm-hmm.
then slowly you see that through time, it's not just ignored, it's actually just written off as non-existent. Then the paradigm starts to emerge that really there is no thing beyond that which we can know empirically, can study through the scientific method with
Right.
empirical observations. And I think that's a problem, because actually we need to relate to life, in order to relate to life in a successful way, in a way that infuses our lives with meaning. There needs to be that higher order. There needs to be that higher order structure. So the cosmos needs to be bigger than that which we can, simply study empirically. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think what we used to do, what used to be a part of our culture, that would allow us to actually relate to that higher order, that higher cosmos, was the realm of symbols, right? And this is what Carl Jung talks about. This is what Joseph Campbell and Erich Neumann talk about. And I think now we live in a culture where that world of symbols has also decayed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those symbols are no longer available to us in order to make sense of life, to make sense of the world, to make sense of the cosmos that we're living in.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a problem because actually those symbols used to help us orient ourselves in our lives and answer the questions that you just posed, like who are we, where are we, and what is the meaning of all of this. And
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have that symbolical language, you're not going to find satisfying answers, that are just sort of dry and analytical. Like you need to have a myth
Well,
that is, has more has
yeah,
more flesh to it.
for sure. But also, on the other hand, to play the devil's advocate, you could read Bernardo Castrop's book, Analytic Idealism, in a nutshell. And that is pretty almost dry philosophical language, which, yeah, well, that gives kind of philosophical, ontological answers. But as a collective and generally for the sense of meaning, we do need those symbols, I think. But I would
Mm-hmm.
say that, um, yeah, like, I think in terms of, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about symbols and symbols to what? Or, um, I think one of the things I was thinking earlier was your point about scientists trying to organize the world. And that's our kind of order, is that through how we can control and manipulate the world and study the world and define it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there's nothing higher than that. I think that
Mm-hmm.
also, it's because in the materialist worldview that makes sense because or it aligns with the idea that in the materialist worldview, human consciousness, like the human organism is the most conscious thing in the universe, the most
Right.
intelligent thing in the universe. So a man is kind of sitting there like this ego, like on a big chair, like I am the king of the universe. I
Mm-hmm.
am the god, basically. And there's nothing but higher than humans, which I think is an absurd idea because in terms of order in the cosmos, like there's got to be, there's got to be. For me, it's there's got to be something more intelligent. There's got to be some sort of fundamental intelligence or some sort of force or first mover or there's some sort of thing that's organizing the universe on a fundamental level. And so I think this is where you start deriving more meaning is just looking at the world and thinking that or seeing that there's more there's more meaning and there's more intelligence in the world creating your body and the whole universe and the trees and everything than you can muster up with your ego.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of this inconceivableness holding everything together, this inconceivable intelligence holding things together. And so I feel like that's where we miss out, where the materialist paradigm is blind to these kinds of things. And that's just one
Mm-hmm.
little example of this worldview that kind of separates out so many other things in life, things that have been intuitive to past generations that are now off
Mm-hmm.
limits,
Mm-hmm.
and we maybe trained ourselves to ignore. Um, yeah.
So so it's interesting, right? That there have been major thinkers and major philosophers who have presented arguments like that. And Bernardo Kastrup is like a contemporary example of that. But in the last century, we've had like huge thinkers, which have also been influential. It's like I was just reading a little bit about Hegel in
Mm-hmm.
John Vervaeke's book, and Hegel also had that project of both coming up with a philosophical thesis that would answer the ontological question, where the conclusions he came to were also of an idealistic nature, where fundamentally reality consists of mind, and the whole constellation of everything together constitutes one sort of overmind or one universal mind. And but at the same time, he also had a social cultural project of trying to
Mm-hmm.
transform the religious life of people. So if we've had that, and there have been some brilliant thinkers, like why have those ideas not latched on? How come
Mm-hmm.
the new paradigm hasn't been ushered in, and how come people live lives, generally speaking, in the cultures that we come from, that are secular and devoid of a deeper meaning?
That
Do people
is
just
a
not
great.
know about it, or like what's going on?
That's a great question. I think it's also you could also add on to that like insights in science, scientific discoveries that actually debunk materialism, that undermine the whole paradigm, like general relativity. I think Einstein's the idea of time and space being relative, like that's pretty profound. Nobody lives as if that's true. And quantum things that kind of break our normal view of reality that are like impossible, like where something can be in two places at once, or one molecule can communicate with another molecule like on the other side of the universe and affect it. And this is what Einstein called spooky action at a distance, which I think is hilarious because he's like, this is not supposed to happen. Like, what is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and even Einstein with I'm not sure if it was with that or maybe another example, but I know that he thought that there must be a problem in his equations. Oh yeah, he thought that reality couldn't be infinite, maybe or something like that. And so he thought, no, the equation's wrong because reality must be finite.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if it's that, but basically there's something like that where his bias affected him so much that it led to that. So it affected how he thought about it. And I think that's what it comes down to with people, with society, is that there's been insights that should undermine the materialist paradigm, or there's been thinkers, people have articulated um, reasons why materialism is not true. But for the collective, it just takes so long. It just takes so long for those things to filter down into society.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just kind
and
of how it
maybe
is.
um, and maybe there's a resistance to it because the materialistic paradigm kind of gives us a feeling of superiority over nature, and makes us feel comfortable in our ego in a way, because it makes us feel like we can have some kind of grip or grasp of what the world is, and it's in a way simple, right? It's simple and essential, and like in principle we can get to know a lot, and we can get to know enough to dominate, and that's where we like to be, because we're safe and comfortable there, and then we can secure our survival. And of course that's also the object of our genes, right? So then that connects with that attitude and reinforces that worldview, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, if you bring in a metaphysics, or if you bring in, a spiritual dimension, then it's much more. I don't know. It's harder to grasp. It's like it's
You're kind of
less
open
it's
to the
less
mystery.
evident. Yeah, and that's also
Yeah.
threatening in a way, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a
Instead of
reason,
being
there's
closed off,
yeah,
that
yeah,
is kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
the materialist paradigm is like almost necessarily that's a defining feature of it almost. It's closed off to
yeah,
history. It's in a
yeah.
box, it's closed off. Which is
It also
interesting.
connects with thinkers like Sigmund Freud, like it's early 20th century, where he in the field of psychology kind of carried the flag of materialism or Darwinism forward, uh, where he also made it an explicit aim of his to guard against the flood of the flood of occultism, right? And
Mm-hmm.
he tried to get Carl Jung, the great Swiss depth psychologist, who used to be a colleague of Sigmund Freud, tried to get
Mm-hmm.
Jung to join his camp, and like he tried to convince Jung to make the theory of the libido, of the blind sex drive, the biological sex drive, into a dogma, and he wanted to make it into a dogma to protect against the onslaught of the flood of occultism that Freud felt genuinely posed a threat to the sanity and rationality of European society, Western society, in a time when coming out of the out of the late 19th century, spirituality was a big thing, and I
Mm-hmm.
think people generally don't know about this. Like in the pre-World War world, spirituality played a major role, and esotericism and occultism played a major role in different factions of society. But this was
For
a
sure.
domain, but people were really contending with that and thinking about it, and there were all kinds of societies that were engaging with that, and then the 20th century happened, and well, it's a complicated history, but But there has been a cultural turn away from that for different reasons. And Freud is one example of, you know, an intellectual figure who had an impact with his theory on our view of man, our view of the world, and our view of man, based on materialistic presumptions and more of a Darwinistic view of human nature, as opposed to Carl Jung, right, who was much more open to um, you know, the mystical dimension of life, and who had a much deeper vision of what the unconscious truly meant, and what type of contents, you know, resided in that sort of subterranean chamber, which for Jung was basically a whole complex of different chambers, whereas for Freud it was a simple little basement, you know, defined by these, you know, biological drives that had been suppressed. So that's a huge difference. But it's Freud who's had the major impact on our culture, I would say, right?
Yeah.
And it's only now that people are starting to get more interested in Carl Jung's works and starting to grasp with what he was talking about. And I think this has something to do with the complexity or the existential challenge involved in actually, you know, dealing with these types of metaphysical dimensions, and that it's for our ego much preferable to presume that, you know, no matter is just the world consists of dead matter, and we're basically isolated to our body, and we have our drives, and you have to work with that, and you just have to sort of work on, you know, on yourself behaviorally, and then and be attuned to society, and then you're a healthy person.
Right.
You know, so that's sort of that's one angle that I think, you know, is
Yeah.
interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah. I think we should maybe define materialism a bit more, like what you were just saying there. Kind of what is the essence of the worldview that is kind of latent in our culture. And I think just to caveat that, I think one thing is that not everyone fully subscribe. Like obviously, it's not a monolithic worldview that everyone believes in and assumes to be true all the time. People have varying beliefs. Like some people are they have materialistic, rationalistic assumptions, but then they have, I think I mentioned this earlier actually, but then they have spiritual leanings and they have intuitions. And if you ask people what they believe in, they'll say, I believe in energy or, you know, there's something, whatever, whatever. So it's kind of a mix, but I would say there's like this underlying kernel operating system that everyone kind of is a part of or is raised in. It's kind of like the air we breathe, all the water that we live in as fish. And we don't even realize that we're swimming in the water. So yeah, I would say some of the defining features of materialism, of this worldview that we're saying is a problem. Because why is it a problem? It's a problem because it doesn't actually doesn't give us enough meaning. Doesn't kind of, it leaves us kind of hungry, our soul's hungry for meaning, for something more. And it's kind of soulless, it's lifeless. And it's fundamentally not true. I think this is the most significant thing, which is kind of like the big news in a way. Only in the last couple of years have we really found more scientifically and more philosophical arguments that are made more soundly, and just kind of like this mounting of evidence over the years, over the centuries even, that has um, basically proven, I would say, um, that the materialist paradigm is not true. So some of the things with the materialist paradigm, I don't know how you would define it, but it's basically like the universe is it's just matter, it's physical matter only, and it's dualistic. So you're basically a body, and you have a little ego, a little man sitting in your head. Basically, you have like a ghost in the machine. You're somehow this conscious being, but you're in your body. You're in this physical world, and the world is basically not intelligent. It's just random. It's basically fluke, chance that we've been created. And there was a big bang, and then a big bang happened, and then for no reason there was just a massive explosion of stuff, and then humans emerged from, they evolved, and there's evolution, and then all emotions and all human drives as well, like kind of this Freudian thing that we can, and this Darwinistic thing that really, like when we fall in love with someone or we feel good things, we fall in love with someone, it's really just serotonin so that we're led to reproduce and like prolong the species. And when you die, there's nothing else after death because you're just a body. So you're basically just physical matter. You're like a 3-dimensional monkey meat suit that's just running around for a couple of years, and then you die. And you try and have fun and get some pleasure and do something good with your life. But still, I think that's a big point, is the fact that in the materialist paradigm, death is just the end because you're a body. And yeah, and then along with that kind of ontological view, the ontology of it, there's also the view of the kind of rationalism and scientism that goes along with materialism, where like there's a bias towards rationality and logic and objectivity, and it's kind of these built-in biases and belief structures that make us think a certain way, that are like logical, and that anything out of the ordinary is dismissed, anything subjective is dismissed. And so, at the end of the day, like you were saying earlier, it's a very mundane and profane universe, and there's not much magic going on. That's kind of part of the ethos of materialism in some of these bigger, some of these scientists, these more militant atheists or something. Kind of part of the ethos is that it's like there's nothing magical or mystical going on. We want to demystify the world,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like we're just science. We understand we can have the sober understanding of everything and do maths and statistics, and we'll just figure out everything one day.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and try and improve the material conditions, and that's about it. So I don't know if you wanted to add something to that kind of.
Well, I was just thinking that that's a very accurate description, I think, and that the important thing is the implications that has, right? And we've
Right.
already addressed some of that. But I think maybe two concepts that I would like to throw in that are relevant when talking about like what are the social cultural implications of our our worldview or the paradigm that we live under, ontological paradigm. Then I think what we see in our society are two major developments that contribute to the crisis that we see, which are atomization and
Mm,
alienation, right?
right.
Which are also there connected. So atomization is the idea that in the social dynamic, in the social cultural world that we live in, more and more people have become individualized through this cultural process that has been unfolding. People identify more with their own personal identity, and see themselves as distinct from other actors, and the focus is very much on the individual and their agency and how they operate in the world and what they make of their lives and what they make of themselves. It's kind of like a neoliberal
Right.
imperative, like you're a free agent. It's incumbent upon you to take responsibility for your life, and then you make something of yourself, and then you're competing with other actors basically, in
Yeah.
that project.
And it's
But
a
the problem that leads to,
no.
yeah, sorry, yeah,
No, I was gonna say it's a zero-sum game. Like
yeah, right,
there's limited resources, and you're an animal,
exactly,
and if you don't survive, you're screwed. And that's kind of a core thing. It's all about survival and maybe some pleasure on the end if you're
right,
lucky.
right. And
Yeah.
then I think what that leads to, one of the things that leads to is alienation. So being estranged or being alienated
Mm.
means that you become a stranger to, and I think you become a stranger to other people, but it doesn't just stay there. I think we live in a world and in a culture where more and more we've become strangers to ourselves. We've become strangers to our own deeper nature. We've become strangers to our own being. It's like because we live in a culture that has become so debased and has become so disentangled from our natural way of living, our
Mm.
natural mode of being, that we've become sort of we ourselves become cultural artifacts that feel more and more absurd, and
Mm.
to the point that we go out into nature and we no longer feel at home there. It's like nature, which has been our environment, our home for since the birth of our species, now has become a place that we've become estranged from. So there's alienation to nature, to the natural world. There's alienation to ourselves. There's alienation towards other people, and I think this is a major problem, that we're facing, which is tied in with with our ontology, with our worldview, with the cosmos that we think we live in, with the cosmos that we've been taught we live in. Right?
For sure. That's a great point. Yeah, really, really good point. Yeah, that alienation is profound, and that also could be a consequence of the way the modern world has developed. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Not even related to the worldview, but it's just kind of a symptom of the world today. It's just like extreme industrialization
Yeah.
and living in like small apartments and
Mm-hmm.
living on
Mm-hmm.
your own and just like having a
Yeah.
job that you could do remotely and all that.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But it does also go along with the atomization of things
Mm-hmm.
because it's an atomistic way of being, and materialism is also an atomistic way of looking at the world. Everything
Right.
can just be clearly defined into little different parts, and there are
Yeah.
actually little different parts that really existed out there in the world that you can just cut up and investigate, and
Yeah. Yeah.
you know that's how you do science. You just cut up a
Yeah.
frog and cut it open
Mm-hmm.
again and keep looking. But the
Yeah.
scientists don't realize that when you keep looking deeper and deeper into the frog and then into the atoms and the molecules, that there's nothing there. There's no matter there,
Right.
which is also one of the things that science has found out already,
Mm-hmm.
that there's basically energy inside an atom. And so physical matter, yeah, but it's also another topic. But yeah, so I was thinking, yeah, so now we should maybe like get into the critique of materialism in general.
Mm-hmm.
Why it's
Yeah.
why it's not true.
Well, I think maybe before you can go into that, because I think you maybe you're very versed in that. There's one thing I would like to throw in, also in terms,
Yeah,
also along
please.
the lines of a critique of materialism or the materialistic paradigm, is that when you live in a world, now that we've come to live in a world that is basically stripped of religious significance, stripped
Hmm.
of the sacred, where the sacred or the sacred cosmos, sort of the religious order, is no longer a determining factor on the way that we organize ourselves social culturally. I think what has emerged in the wake of that, to a large extent, and leading to some of the aforementioned problems, is that there are other principles that have taken over in structuring our society, and I think some of these principles, lead to major problems. And you could talk about capitalism, for instance. The kind of the capitalistic imperative or the neoliberal imperative. The reason why
Hypercapitalism. Yeah.
I think the reason why they're so pernicious and they're so um, their effects are so huge on determining the shape of our cultural life, is because of the vacuum that has been left by the religious values that once shaped our cultural life, and that now it's become like it's like a certain logic. The capitalist logic determines social interactions, determines cultural dynamics and cultural
Right.
mechanisms. But it turns out that actually, even though it's a very powerful, a powerful logic, um, it's not actually attuned with a higher harmony, right? It's not actually attuned with a higher order. So it has a lot of power, and it's like a huge mammoth tanker, right? That sort of just
Hmm.
plows through its course, but that is not. It's not guided by higher principles, right? It's just fed by, in a way, the ego's desire to look after itself. Because if you live in a world devoid of a higher structure where you have a role to play, and it's just about this zero sum game, this competition for resources in order to look after your own survival and your own pleasure. It's about maximizing your pleasure in this life, and you're just competing with others. Then that becomes the organizing principle of society, and it just gets scaled. And then what we see are the consequences of that, and it's derailing the species, because this
Absolutely.
logic is so powerful, like it takes over the entire globe, and it's messing up not only our ecosystems, but it's also messing ourselves up psychologically, because of its cultural and social consequences. I think a lot of the modern malaise, it can be tied back to that. But my point is that even though it's often critiqued, right, and it's often flagged as a problem, I don't think it's so often also connected to a change in our ontology, and change in our worldview that has allowed this actually to, have such a strong determining influence. Because there are no higher values that are believed in, then it can take over, right? So that's why I think there's extra relevance to addressing that ontological question, to addressing the question of the worldview, or the world of meaning that we inhabit. Because otherwise we're at the mercy of some of these more blind organizing principles. Just like a blind libidic lust, it's like the capitalistic logic is also blind. It's not enlightened, right? It's not an enlightened guiding principle. And so there's more relevance even to it just it underscribes the relevance of this project.
For sure. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, just lost my train of thought there for a second, but yes, definitely the lack of higher values is a big thing, and the values being tied to the material, to the ontology. That's definitely, yeah. There's a vacuum, and then vacuum of religious values, and then the problem with that is that what is fooled by that is basically our lower nature in a way, like, and our animal logic in a way,
right?
Like that classic esoteric idea of there being a higher nature and a lower nature to man, or lower and higher nature to man. And there's just kind of like there's the world, there's the Maya, the illusory world, or the animal-based world, where you have your animal drive, your animal instincts. And then it's kind of like, if we're left with no bigger organizing principle or values, then all we have is like what we're kind of left to our own devices, which is our bodies, our biological bodies. And yeah, then it feels like a free for all, and you're kind of alone in the world.
Yeah.
Like that Alan Watts quote as well. It's like a lot of people feel like it's like there's a poem or something where it's like, alone in the world, afraid, and alone in a world I never made. Yeah, it's this alienation. Yeah. But yeah, so in terms of defining the problems with materialism, why it's not true fundamentally, and why we know that it's not true now, I think there's a lot of things you can say about this. I think we'll just briefly touch on some of the reasons that are so, but it's so profound, it's so significant, because now there's kind of like a new budding intellectual trend or intelligentsia that is kind of in agreement. There's kind of a chorus of people now, I would say, that agree that materialism is just not sufficient anymore to deal with the philosophical problems that it has. There's too many contradictions, and it's basically insufficient. So some of them, like the first one that comes to mind, is the mind-body problem. I think I'll just go through a couple, not get into it too deeply. But the mind-body problem and the emergence problem, it's basically the question of consciousness and what is consciousness. So materialism and science, the moment, cannot define consciousness. It can't explain consciousness. And it can't explain how consciousness emerges out of the brain, because the brain is just a physical thing. It's just physical matter. And somehow then we have subjectivity. We have the experience of being human. And in the materialist paradigm, there's basically a leap of faith that is taken from there being a physical brain, which is made up of chemicals and atoms and molecules and a binary code in a way, and a lot of complex physical processes, that somehow that automatically becomes consciousness. So there's just a leap of faith. It's not explained. Scientists say that they'll explain it one day, but it's basically not really feasible. It's not possible, I would say, because it's quite an impossible position, because you're trying to explain how, like, consciousness can emerge out of physical matter. So it's like trying to explain how a rose or a flower can emerge out of a brick. Like how is a brick just going to turn into a organic plant? It's not going to happen. And so there's basically no explanation. We live in a world where there's no explanation for how consciousness works, for how it is. And some people, materialists, will go as far as to deny that consciousness is even significant, or they'll call it ephemery and epiphenomenon. And so like they'll say consciousness is just an illusion, and all those things like emotions and fluff. I think I actually had a lecturer in my philosophy class once when I asked him, what about emotions and subjectivity and, consciousness in general and the whole content of the world that's made up? And he just said, well, maybe that's just extra fluff, we don't need to explain that. The absurdity of that is so crazy because consciousness and your subjectivity is your entire life world. And it's basically the fundamental thing that we are interfacing with the world with, and that we are consciousness, I would say. And also from phenomenology, that becomes a kind of self-evident fact that your subjectivity is fundamental and it can never be escaped. So you can never get outside of subjectivity. And so if you can't explain subjectivity, or you just brush it under the rug, then what's going on? Because you can't explain the fundamental experience of being human. So that's one element of critique against materialism, ontologically. But also the other things are, this kind of psychic phenomenon that we see, things like telepathy and psychic experiences, things like, that there was a recent podcast, obviously the telepathy tapes, which kind of demonstrated scientifically that these autistic kids have telepathic experiences, and you could kind of prove that there's telepathic experiences. But more than that, when you look into the literature, you find that vastly in terms of there's, whether it's telepathy or synchronicities or precognition or psychedelic or mystical experiences or near-death experiences, you just find there's a vast amount of literature. It indicates that these things are real phenomena that happen to people, and they've always happened to people. But in our paradigm, we just kind of brush it under the rug. And so these kinds of things, break the materialist paradigm. And so if you accept that telepathy is possible, that let's say between a mother and a child, in the case of the telepathy tapes, a mother and a severely autistic child who's nonverbal, the connection between the mother and the child allows them to kind of understand what's going on with each other without saying it. So that means that there's a non-physical connection between two minds, which means that the world and human beings are not just physical only. And so that's kind of contentious because a lot of people won't accept that evidence. But I would say that it's pretty substantial, the mounting evidence of psychic things and spiritual experiences that exist. So that's one element of that. You also have in physics, in quantum physics, you have the observer effect, where particles behave differently when they're being observed. And like spooky action at a distance, like Einstein called it, where one molecule can affect another molecule in a different point in space with no physical connection. So, Einstein was talking about this like almost 100 years ago. So that's pretty, how can one molecule affect another molecule on the other end of space if there's no physical connection? So the world cannot only be physical. So yeah, I would say that's a bit of a summary of some of the critiques you can make. You can make a whole hour-long conversation about that.
Yeah. The Flip by Jeffrey Kripal is an interesting book, also illustrating some of those examples.
Right. Brilliant. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of with the examples of scientists, over and over again, people having these profound, unexplainable experiences that can't be explained in the materialist paradigm, but it happens, and it happens. And he, in his book, focuses on it happening to scientists and highly rational people that then admit that these things have happened.
Yeah.
And I think near-death experiences are also a hugely interesting phenomenon where people have similar experiences with shared characteristics when they die. And basically, when people die, they almost have a mystical experience. They have a profound out-of-body experience, a profound experience of like golden light energy or some sort of divine angelic presence, or merging with the whole universe. And then they come back to their body. And that just happens over and over again. There's literally countless examples of this. So, yeah. So you can actually go so deep into all that, and there's all these philosophical objections and responses to all that. But yeah, so maybe we'll just leave it at that for now. That, you know, there's a lot of people, and there's a lot of reason to think that materialism is not true ontologically. But then, in terms of the lack of meaning and the effect it has on people, that's maybe more relevant for now. Yeah, I'm trying to think of some of the other more profound arguments. I mean, for me, I feel like just the fact of consciousness and the intelligence of the universe, and the fact that consciousness exists and it's the most fundamental thing, and it's not explained. It's kind of like consciousness is the ultimate problem or wrench in the materialist worldview. And I think I heard Rick Archer saying, the host of Buddha at the Gaspam, saying in some podcast that Nature magazine, Science magazine put out a list of the 100 biggest problems, like the most important problems that science needs to solve. And second on the list was explaining consciousness, like what is consciousness. So we're living in this world where we don't know what consciousness is, which is what we are fundamentally.
Right.
And we don't know what happens after we die. And we think that there's nothing greater than humans. And the world is dead matter, which I don't know. Patently, it doesn't make sense because there's so much intelligence, there's so much consciousness right here. So, yeah. I'll say that's what I have to say about that for now. Quite a massive topic when you really start getting into this.
Yeah. The question remains, I guess, of once we've accepted and established that materialism is insufficient in explaining reality, and it's also insufficient in answering our existential questions. And we're creatures that live by meaning, right? We live in a world of meaning, and we need to live in a world of meaning that sustains us and gives us a purpose, right? And so once we've established that materialism doesn't give us that, then the question remains of like, okay, so what should take its place in terms of a worldview, right? And I think this is an interesting one. It's like I was talking to a friend yesterday about some of the things that we're talking about now, and she was asking me like, what do you think a perfect society would look like, or what is the new world, what does the new world look like, once we grow out of this paradigm and a new paradigm establishes itself. And the words of Joseph Campbell sprang to mind, that consciousness, is, as in sort of ego consciousness, cannot come up with the answer to that. It cannot conjure up or sort of contrive the answer to those questions of its own accord or out of its own volition. Fundamentally, what's necessary is for us to engage in a process of what in his framework, which he adopts from Carl Jung, is a process of confronting the unconscious. And actually, it's by going into the unconscious that we can find those symbols, that those symbols by which we have lived for millennia can be revived and perhaps rejuvenated. And I think the point is that, it's kind of like a heroic calling, and that heroic calling means, well, it has, I think, in that sense, our cultural moment and the meaning crisis has tremendous personal implications, because actually what it asks of the individuals that constitute the culture is that they themselves embark on that quest of confronting the unknown world, the world that no longer makes sense, the world that no longer is familiar, encounter that world, see what we find there, and then let the sense be born in us. Or the way of making sense. The way of making sense is something that you earn by going through that process. I think then certain things will reveal themselves and certain lessons will be learned. But you have to be open, and you have to acknowledge, like, I have to acknowledge, like, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's really going on behind the scenes. I don't know what the larger picture is. I don't know what role I'm playing exactly, but I believe there is something to discover there. So I accept the call to adventure in sort of going on this quest of finding out. And then by going in through that process and being open to being radically open, and in a way agnostic, and remain agnostic, and then I'm open, and then I engage with whatever I encounter in my life. And for me personally, that means that I go into these existential challenges. I go into existential challenges with open eyes. Right? I choose to not walk away from that, but I choose to go into that, even though it scares me, because I feel like I need to do that. I need to confront the chaos in my life. I need to confront the chaos in myself, and struggle with it, grapple with it, and find maybe the right mode of dealing with it, which sometimes turns out to be, a form of self-sacrifice, a self-sacrifice to that very chaos that you're trying to protect yourself against. And while there's different shapes and forms that process might take, but you can be sure that it's an adventure, right? And for me, there's a lot of relevance to that personal dimension for me, of going through those processes and learning my lessons and building my character by going through life in the midst of all of this chaos. And I think then what you then encounter is sort of an emergent sense of what is right and what is wise. I think wisdom is then earned through that process, and I think as a cultural agent, it's incumbent upon me to engage in this process, because I think it's the integrity of the cultural sphere is determined by its constituent to the individuals that constitute it. And the way that we make sense as a culture is dependent on the way that the sense we find as individuals, and the lessons we learn, and the wisdom we acquire. And I think in a culture where, to a large extent, it has been my experience that the wise elders are absent, right? It's like, who can I turn to in my community for wisdom, right? Where's the wise elder? I think a lot of people in our society, and a lot of people of our generation, find that they don't know who to turn to, because a lot of people don't seem to be able to offer them what they need. I think the solution to that problem is that we need to become those elders, those wise elders ourselves. And that means that you have to engage with life even though you don't have the answers. And so I don't have the answer to what the world is going to look like, but I'm trying to make my own contribution to that end, and then allow it to emerge as it will, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautifully put. Yeah, I think, yeah, as individuals, there's a big way that, you have to kind of engage with this process of meaning making and kind of building a new worldview on your own as an individual. In some
Yeah.
degree, it can't be avoided. Um, And yeah, I think collectively, I mean, I could imagine some scenarios that might happen. That might be good ways forward, but I mean, who knows what's going to happen? But yeah, I think given the state we're in, where we've got this lack of the overarching meaning structure, and we've got this insufficient, unsatisfying current meaning structure, and we've got this epistemic chaos, this cultural chaos, moral
Mm-hmm.
decay. I think people, I don't know. Yeah, I agree. I tend to agree. I think the only real solution that's available, I mean, at least as an individual, that you can go and you can build your own meaning from the ground up. You can actually build your own new worldview from the ground up. And I think that's a lot of what this podcast is about, is basically constructing your own new worldview. It's us constructing our own worldview.
Yeah, and in a way, I think the moment that we're living in, that there's also a blessing to the fact that there's no longer, kind of a central monolithic meaning structure that's held in
Right.
place by authorities, because it used to be the case that you wanted to diverge and build your own worldview, or if you wanted to dissent, in your philosophical convictions. That there was very little possibility of doing that, and if you did do that, you had a chance of just being hanged or stoned or burnt at the stake, right?
Right. Now you can
Or
just
in
get
other,
stoned and think of ideas. Just chill out.
yeah,
You know
exactly.
what's gonna.
There's a radical liberty there to just
Right.
believe whatever you want to believe, right? As long as it's not too crazy, or it doesn't lead to erratic behavior or something, then society is going to generally respect that. Whereas even in a a few decades ago, I think people would have been much more dogmatic about about also their materialistic worldview, or
Hmm.
their sort of their scientism.
Or even 10 years ago.
Hmm.
Yeah, I
So it's
agree.
a
I think
fertile
that's also,
time.
yeah, for sure. I think that's a great point, and it's also good to clarify that we don't. It's not like the pre-scientific world of Christianity, this one kind of mono view of things, this very simplistic dogma with superstition and pre-rational thinking. That's not the answer, and that it is a
Hmm.
good. There is a benefit to moving. It is an evolution. It is an enlightenment to some sense to moving into rationalism and science and objectivity, and dispensing with the externalized view of God. I guess that's one thing, but also the superstition and the control and the very small-minded dogma that has reigned over humans for a long time.
Yeah.
So now it's kind of fallen apart. Well, so we've let go of that. We've kind of grown out of that, and now we have science there. But science is not the same thing as a spiritual meaning structure. So there's now fertile ground. There's a gap. There's a gap in the market for a new worldview. So yeah. So
Maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of where the cultural conversation is happening right now, and where that how that conversation is being steered, and what the implications of that are. If you think
what do you
about
mean, like in the
how much people are on their phones and sort of engaging with social media content, how much the world of
right?
ideas is influenced by that.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's yeah. So at the moment, I mean, people. If you really think about what's going on right now, everyone's on their phones all the time. Most people have a phone addiction, and they're on the internet all the time. And obviously, the internet is a new thing that's only existed for about 10, 20 years. And in the grand scheme of history, that's just like a tiny, tiny piece of time. And so it's a brand new system, and it's this giant sharing of information. And now it's totally new. And so now the cultural conversation is happening in this peer-to-peer way, this totally democratic, unfiltered mass communication that's never happened before. And so we're also kind of left to our own devices again. We're left to just our lowest impulses. The algorithm, these platforms are created with like a capitalistic profit incentive that drives the conversation. And so it's basically sensationalism and just the fact that, but what's going on is that there are still trends and there are still kind of a monolith. So one thing that I've wondered about this is there like a new online culture that transcends countries and cultures, that everyone's kind of aware of this global conversation? Or is everyone just stuck in their siloed echo chambers? And I think it's a bit of both. And sometimes both apply. Sometimes each one applies in different situations. But in a sense, there is this kind of space that's emerging, a new space that's emerging, where people are talking about the world and making sense of the world together through millions of tiny little thoughts and comments and ideas that have these implications. And now there's no longer the cultural meaning makers, the sanctioned cultural meaning makers like the church. I mean, that was long gone. But now science and like the media and news. So it's also like we've had this authority structure that was like, this is what reality is, this is what the world is. Now that's also thrown out the window. Now it's just like a free for all. It's like the kids' table is deciding what's going on now, in a sense. It's just like memes. It's like memes and big boobs, and then philosophy and self help, and then the manosphere, and I mean it's chaos. And so yeah, so that's also fertile ground, I guess. But yeah, it's also chaotic. That's part of the meaning crisis, I would say, is that very chaos, that the epistemic chaos, the not knowing how to decide what's true and what's false as well.
Yeah.
You know, that's another big thing that people really feel now, is the lack of. It's like, how do we know what's true and what's not true anymore? So we don't know what's right and wrong. We don't know what's true and false. And it's because like this relativism and aperspectival madness just turned to the extreme. It's just being turned up more and more every day, it seems like now.
Yeah. And we don't have a goal, right? We don't have a purpose. We don't have something to live for.
Exactly.
And so all of those things just only contribute to negative emotion, right? So there's no wonder we have a mental health crisis. It's like no wonder. You know?
Right. And I think, yeah, and I think now it's like nobody's really stopping to think about whether you should. Like, obviously, people know that it's bad to scroll on your phone for like 6 hours a day, but it's almost just part of the air we breathe now. It's just being on the phone all the time, and the instant gratification and the dopamine from social media. And I think it's just a symptom of the lack of like a moral imperative or a moral dimension to life. Like, you know, people just will spend years of their life now just like browsing mindless information. And,
Right.
you know, because why else? What else are you going to do when you get home from work? There's
Yeah,
nothing
it's
else
just
to do.
consuming also, right? It's not consuming, it's not sort of engaging with information, you know, towards some end. It's just for the instant gratification. So it's just about that short cycle of consumption. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's extreme. Yeah. So now there's this insane chaos going on. So what the point of this podcast is to kind of create a way of making sense of everything, to make sense of the world, to create meaning, to understand meaning, to grapple with these questions, and kind of factor everything in to like, you know, to come to some sort of coherent worldview that actually makes sense and that's actually satisfying and nourishing. And that actually has a progression and unfoldment, like a journey to it that goes deeper and deeper, and you know, relates to an individual and to the collective, and factors in all these elements and actually makes sense. And I think that's what a lot of people just don't know is possible. They don't know that the kind of worldview that me and you have been developing over the last couple of years, that it's actually possible to go back into the history books and you know, the old philosophies and religions and religious thought and ancient wisdom, and find real deep profound truth there and meaning, and for it to be compatible with modern science, and for, you know, epistemology and metaphysics and all these things to kind of come together into a coherent whole that's synthetic and alive. I mean, like, it's like a synthesis, and
Yeah.
it makes sense, you know. And you know, it ties back to the rejected knowledge idea, that there's all this forgotten knowledge in society, that people are not aware of the fact that there is coherent meaning to be found.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. that's the thing also. If you think about these worldviews, the older religious worldview, if you think about the traditional dogmatic Christian worldview, to take one example, right? Then really what that prescribed for people was a way to live their lives. It's like, this is how you're supposed to be. This is how you're supposed to live your life. This is how you're a good person. Don't do that and do that. Basically, sort of prescribing the way to live your life, with the aim of, in a way, securing your fate in the afterlife, right? Or avoiding God's judgment and winning God's
Right.
grace. That's kind of the point, right? And so, in a way, that there's also something shallow to that, I
Oh
think,
yeah.
and I'll explain later how I mean that. Then you compare that with the scientific materialist paradigm that we've been talking about, where really, on the one hand, like, there's no prescription of how to live your life. There's no longer any consensus on like what you're supposed to do. It's sort of relative, moral relativism, etc. And then in that type of vacuum, what emerges are these base drives, these more animalistic instincts that lead us to all these different forms of addiction, right? And pursuing short-term gratification and sort of hedonistic pleasure, which is also shallow, right? And I think what both of these actually lack, which is the thing that we maybe most desperately need, is some kind of developmental structure. We need to understand our lives as a profound and meaningful, developmental process. And that
Mm.
once you reach adulthood, you haven't stopped. That you're not done yet. It's not like you leave high school, you're 18, and sort of you're done developing, or you're in your mid-20s and you're done developing. I think what's essential is this idea that there's something much greater that you could be. There's something much greater that you could become if you were to realize your potential. And everybody kind of has that feeling. It's like, I know that I have potential there, which is an interesting concept, because what is that? But it feels very real. It feels almost tangible. It's like, I have potential, and I know that for me to actualize, to realize that potential, what is required of me is to engage in a certain process, engage in certain processes, and maybe avoid other processes. So there's something prescriptive about that. But the point is not just to secure your fate in the afterlife. The point is to go through this developmental process in this life and become something greater, something that you could be, yet not yet are, right? And that applies to us individually, but it applies to us as a species, as a culture. Like, we could be something much greater, but it requires something of us, and we need to, all as individuals, we need to take responsibility for our own process of becoming, our self-actualization, our development, becoming more of who we're supposed to be. If you accept that there is maybe something you're supposed to be, or you could become, the potential. I think there's an imperative to live in a way that you work towards that, and that there is an intrinsic meaning to be found in that process, and that gives so much more dimensionality to this life compared to both the old dogmatic, religious worldview, which is inherently also more limiting, and the scientific materialism that leads to a lack of a deeper meaning, and where development kind of also falls by the wayside. And I think you can contrast those with, for instance, with more of the fringe currents of, for instance, spiritual traditions or mystical schools, where this idea of there being some potential for you to realize, there being some kind of calling, to become something greater, has very much been a core part of these teachings in these schools of thought, and they're mostly. They've mostly been sort of the esoteric undercurrents in the West, right? Where it's sort of, it's kind of more exclusive for certain, for certain members of society who felt very strongly called towards that type of adventure, but it wasn't necessarily part of the broader, mainstream cultural
all reserved to like
life world.
Christian. Yeah, all reserved to monks or nuns, like a
Right.
priest. Someone can go and become a priest and then just dedicate their life to God, but
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
average person is good enough to just believe and just be a good person, and
Right.
be successful, and that's it. Even within
Yeah.
a Christian context.
And for
Whereas
me, this
also,
is a
yeah,
yeah.
no, continue.
Well, for me, this is a crucial idea, and this is the idea that gives my life meaning. Is that there's something I am becoming, that there's something I'm working
Mm.
towards, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and that's real and tangible. That you really actually go through transformations if you decide to take on if you decide to answer the call to adventure, then there are real boons to be earned along the way, right? And there is substantial growth that occurs, and that's growth that's immaterial, right? It's the growth of your consciousness, it's the growth of your character, and I think by engaging in that process and by going on that path, you become inevitably you become a more valuable member of society, and you become somebody that becomes that comes to embody wisdom, and therefore become a resource for other people along the path. And this for me is sort of an intrinsic meaningful quality of life
Yeah,
that has
I love that.
that's come about through learning about different ways of looking at the world, and learning from from depth psychology and from ancient wisdom traditions about the true potential uh, of man, humankind.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a brilliant point, and I think we should maybe go deeper into that and think about what it means, like the becoming. Because I've had the same thought about that, thinking about meaning and what should we do with ourselves aside from, taking care of the survival needs and making sure you have money and you have family and relationships and stuff like that. You know,
Yeah,
what else is there to do in your free time, or what else is there grounding your life? And I think that is a major point that gives your life meaning. That it's not just improving to get some sort of material benefit, some sort of pleasure, or some sort of carrot at the end of the stick. Um, that there's some sort of evolution going on in your
and
consciousness.
it's not about acquiring more wealth or more material possessions either,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, because why would you? Because you're going to die anyway. So that's not big
Right.
enough. That's not good
No.
enough to justify that kind of a pursuit, because you're going to die anyway. But maybe the soul is immortal ultimately, and so you transcend death, which is what we learn from these spiritual traditions, I would say. In which
Mm-hmm.
case, that gives it so much more meaning to this kind of evolution towards more goodness and wholeness and truth and beauty in a way. Just because this progression that you're on, this journey that you're on, it's not just you're not going to lose it when you die. I mean, that's of course the promise or the claim of these religious traditions, but it starts to make more sense with the near-death experience stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really something that people are missing, is they don't see that there's this kind of inner process that you can be doing, this inner work
Right.
that you can be doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know about it. They're not paying it. No one has pointed out to them that there's this inner psychological existential growth that can be happening
Right. And it's so
on a really
substantial. It's so
mm,
substantial.
yeah
And people are very reluctant to engage in the process because the process often involves actually, facing that which you least want to face.
mm,
The things that you are most afraid of.
of
You know,
course, those are
they
the most
they
juiciest things. Yeah.
exactly. That's where the potential for growth is the biggest, right?
Mm,
And so that means that like you are a person that's really afraid of that thing, and that's how you conceptualize of yourself. And then you're in a limit. You have a limited view of yourself. You are that person who is like that, who is very afraid of this one thing. But that then you forget, or almost can't believe that there is somebody you could be who is no
mm,
longer afraid of that thing, and that the way to become that person who is no longer afraid, there's only one way to become that person, and that is actually by going straight into that thing that you fear, in a way
right.
embracing the thing you want to run away from, right? uh, and holding space to it, being open to it, and engaging with whatever it is that induces that fear, or if it invokes that fear. And then by that process only, can you earn the access to that other version of you, which is substantially further along its path of development. Then there are people who go through their whole lives avoiding that, You don't need to
Uh-huh.
be a psychologist to see that,
Uh-huh.
and it makes total sense also, because there's a lot in us that that motivates us to want to either flee or fight against the thing that
Uh-huh.
is so fear inducing.
And so that would be the process of self-actualization, part
Mm-hmm.
of that process. And, you
Yeah,
could look
yeah,
at
yeah.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs and kind of make the argument that to solve the meaning crisis, just everyone needs to just deal with their self-actualization,
Right.
self-transcendence needs. And that would be great for everyone if they could,
Yeah,
though.
yeah, yeah.
Because, Maslow had the hierarchy of needs with the survival needs and the more base needs, and then the self-actualization at the top of the pyramid, which is kind of exemplified by what you were talking about.
Yeah.
But then later on in his life, he added self-transcendence also above that. Not a lot of people know that. Um, and that's also the other dimension of the evolution that can go on, is the self-transcendence or self-realization, the kind of the more deeper spiritual pursuit,
Mm.
which is kind of realizing more and more the profundity and the beauty and the magic of life,
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of inherent almost divinity of your own consciousness, and the existential like power and I don't know how to describe it, but the whole spiritual dimension as well is something that people don't know about. And I think it all kind of comes together nicely in a picture like in Joseph Campbell's uh, picture of the hero's journey from his book The Hero with a Thousand Faces, where he describes something like the monomyth, which is such a beautiful, profound concept, where there's one myth throughout human history that keeps being repeated in our mythologies, one kind of core set of mythologies that come out of the unconscious and are expressed into these myths and projected into all these stories and myths. And they represent a monomyth, which really represents some sort of profound evolution and journey and call to adventure that is in every single human being. And that we are kind of on this trajectory, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not. It's kind of like the only game in town is this evolution of consciousness that's going
Right.
on. And I think a lot of people in our society don't know that because our society is blind to that. And, that's a really big thing that you don't necessarily have to answer all these, philosophical questions and get to like philosophical nerdiness and get to the core of it, or have some sort of profound mystical experience that blows your brains out and you become one with everything. You can just realize that there's like progression to your life and that you're striving towards a higher principle, and
Yeah.
you're actually expanding and becoming more whole as you
Right.
go. And it's the ultimate challenge as well. You're slaying the dragon all the time,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
Jordan
yeah, yeah,
Peterson
yeah.
would say. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot more to delve in. I don't think that we touched on all of the concepts that we wanted to touch on in the first episode,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll get to those,
Yeah.
and we can
Yeah,
also
for sure.
flesh out everything we discussed again
Yeah, and I think
about. Yeah,
we have mentioned a few thinkers and authors, and there's a wealth more to talk about. And a very meaningful project, I think, to engage with all of these different ideas, and to kind of to bring them in and to see what they can afford us, or how they might serve us, and see where they fit into the puzzle, right? Um,
right. I think we
yeah,
didn't talk about the rejected knowledge aspect, which is
right.
interesting, and
We also
we'll
didn't talk
definitely.
about Eastern spirituality that much.
Right. So I think, yeah, yeah. So the rejected knowledge and the fact of the ancient wisdom narrative, or the perennialism,
Hmm.
and that a big part of this podcast will be us going back and mining and and mining all the great old ideas of the past that are forgotten, and gentrifying them and bringing them into the modern world to
Yeah,
find some meaning in this world and crafting our own worldview. I think that's a great that's really kind of the essence of what we're doing here, and we're kind
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
documenting that in a way and
Right.
creating a shared recorded worldview that is um that brings in just a vast amount of ideas and beliefs and traditions and perspectives and including that and making sense of it.
Exactly. It will be like like an IV infusion of meaning.
Right. Slowly dripping into you. Lots of meaning.
Episode by episode.
Lots of meaningful meaning. Yeah. Yeah, the rejected knowledge is a big theme, and mining the past, and many things. There's basically no limits, so we're just going to talk about whatever we both are interested in.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Do you
and
already want to maybe signpost, some of the potential topics for future episodes we've talked about? So just sort of go through the list and mention a few, um, just to give an idea of that. I can name a few that we wrote down, right?
yeah,
Like the ones that you were naming, and then those are sort of the Eastern traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, the Vedas, but also look at Sufi mysticism, for instance, from the Islamic tradition, and then of course there's this whole wealth of currents within the Western tradition, which are sort of labeled under the term esotericism or like rejected knowledge that you talked about, which is actually what we both did a master's in. So we'll definitely be talking about that. So then you're talking about Hermeticism, and Neoplatonism, the history of alchemy, the history of occultism, like this occult traditions of the 19th century, and basically a 2,000-year history of these undercurrents, spiritual undercurrents in the West. We talk about Christian mysticism, right, or Christian esotericism. And sort of also then juxtaposing these different traditions to see, where do they overlap, and the more controversial sort of perennialist readings of these traditions, where we can actually look at them as well, shedding light on some similar universal underlying issues, and they're not just unique; they also have fundamental similarities, which are definitely very interesting to expose and to talk about, because that might actually point towards something deep. And it goes a little bit further than just be kind to your neighbor and be a good person. There are deep, profound maps of a metaphysical terrain, so to speak, that might
yeah.
actually
Might be some
inform a very
unexpected findings in there, like Kundalini related things or something like that.
yeah. And then there's the whole philosophy, metaphysics, and consciousness debate, where we talk about ontology, epistemology, materialism, and the debate around that. Uh, uh, as psychedelics and their ontological implications, things like psi phenomena or psychic phenomena. And I would love to delve into, depth psychology, especially the Jungian tradition, and how that might enrich a worldview and a view of ourselves. Then we talk about culture, right? About politics, about meaning making as a cultural project, but also as a personal project, right? And that's also maybe tapping into sort of self-help type of topics.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we'll be doing interviews with some great thinkers. That might hopefully enrich the dialogue. Anything I'm forgetting?
Well, no, but there's so much that's still going to be discussed that we haven't listed down either.
Yeah, of
So
course.
yeah, yeah, it's pretty. We got a big project on our hands. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Should we wrap it up there?
Yeah, sounds good. To be continued then.
To be continued. Thanks for tuning in.